let's move to the lead debate for this evening. So you can imagine the extent of the power crisis by an important step that the centre has taken to tackle it. They've invoked Section 11 of the Electricity Act, which mandates all imported coal-based projects to generate power at full capacity. So Section 11 of the Act provides that the government in extraordinary circumstances may ask a generating company to operate and maintain any station in accordance with its directions. The order late last night comes amidst projections of high peak demand in the months to come, which can go up as much as 220 gigawatts. To put that in perspective, the highest demand in a day so far has been 207 gigawatts. Now, this comes in the backdrop of another important decision which was taken by the Delhi state government. And they announced that the government will now give people the option to choose whether they want subsidies in electricity or not. Remember, so far, and this has been the key promise of the Kejriwal government, and perhaps what has got them their second term in power, that citizens in Delhi do not have to pay for electricity up to 200 units of usage. Now, from October, you will not get that blanket reprieve if you're in Delhi. You will have to go and apply for this reprieve from the government. Delhi Chief Minister Arvind Kejriwal made that announcement yesterday. Let's just quickly listen in to what he said.
अब हमने तय किया कि हम ये ऑप्शन देंगे, हम लोगों से पूछेंगे क्या आपको बिजली की सब्सिडी चाहिए। अगर वो कहेगा हाँ चाहिए तो हम उनको देंगे, अगर वो कहेगा नहीं चाहिए तो हम उनको नहीं देंगे। तो ये लोगों से पूछने का काम जल्दी शुरू होगा और 1 अक्टूबर से दिल्ली के अंदर उन्हीं लोगों को बिजली की सब्सिडी दी जाएगी जो लोग बिजली की सब्सिडी मांगेंगे।
The Kejriwal government has now, in a sense, eased up the extent of subsidy that they were giving to the people of Delhi. But will other states also take similar route? Now, remember, Delhi is not the first or the last state to give either free electricity or subsidized electricity or some kind of a relief to certain sections of society on electricity. It's very common for state governments, for political parties to offer free electricity, especially to sections of society like farmers ahead of elections. It's a big poll draw, but it is essentially the root cause of what we are seeing right now, because this free subsidy and free electricity is not really free. Someone has to pay for it. So when governments offer this free electricity, the discoms are supposed to get the money from the governments. The discoms don't get it in time, so they don't pay the power generating companies in time. And today you have the central government asking everyone to make sure they have enough coal up to capacity. It's because these sections of the whole power cycle have not been financed enough that they don't want to import expensive coal. Let me now bring in my colleague Prakash just to give us some perspective of how many states really have these arrears and have not paid their electricity bill.
When the country is facing perhaps its biggest coal crisis, several discussions are going on actually whose fault is this. Now government is forcing state governments and power generation companies to import coal at any cost to deal with the current coal crisis. But many states and the power generation companies are finding it difficult to import 10% coal for blending due to financial constraint. But the question is why they are in such financial trouble. Now look at the data. In the month of April, discoms outstanding dues to generation companies has crossed rupees 1.23 lakhs crore. Means discoms are not in a position to pay, power generation companies outstanding dues. Now look at another data. Subsidy and the power dues of discoms on state governments is approximately rupees 1.7 lakhs crore. And this state of affair is perhaps the biggest hurdle in revival of the discoms. States are not revising tariff despite higher cost, which is increasing, their financial burden. AT&C losses of many states discoms is still about 20%. All India gap between the average cost of supply and average revenue realized is, 32 paise per kilowatt hour. Central government has tried its bits, they have made key provision in the proposed, electricity amendment bill, which was related to the direct electricity subsidy into the bank account of the consumer. But but this provision has been dropped by the central government because of the huge protest by the state governments.
All right, thank you for that. My colleague Prakash there with that detailed report on what really is going on. To speak more on this, I'm joined now by Harry Dhaul, he's Director General at the Independent Power Producers of India Association. Anil Razdan, former Power Secretary, is joining us, as is Dhiraj Nayar, Chief Economist at Vedanta. Welcome to all of you and thank you for speaking with us. Dhiraj, great to have you on the show after a very long time. Let me begin with your take on the premise we're setting today, because we've been speaking about the power crisis in great detail for several days now. But I think not enough attention has been paid to the role of freebies in corrupting the entire cycle of payments, which may have contributed to the state we're in today. Would you agree with that?
Well, I mean, we know this has been the longest pending problem in India's power sector, in the state of the discoms. It's nothing new. Somehow we get along, but we come to situations like we have now, where the demand, it's unprecedentedly hot, demand is unprecedentedly high. The fact is that international coal prices, national commodity prices are high, which is squeezing the plants to import. So I think the problem of the discoms of freebies is not new, and it comes into the public eye every time demand or supply become issues. Otherwise we tend to just kick the can down the road and carry along.
I agree, Dhiraj, that it's not new. That is not new. But the reason I think it needs...
But the point is...
it needs focus today because the free ride has to end at some point.
Yes, the free ride for anything has to end for two reasons. One, nobody, as a consumer, you will not rationally use a product or a resource if it's not priced. Obviously, if you're getting something free, there is no incentive to save on it or use it rationally. You use it. So in terms of energy efficiency of use, a price is very important. Secondly, as you said, someone has to pay, and let's not make any mistake. We say the government pays in the end. The government doesn't pay. You and I pay. The taxpayer pays. The government has no money. The government earns from taxpayers, right? So in the end, one way or the other, we can take a freebie. But in the end, 4 years or 5 years down the road, some taxes are going to have to be raised, and the people have to pay for it. And if you think that you're not paying income tax, so you can get away, that's another illusion, because everybody ultimately pays VAT or an indirect tax on buying everything. So ultimately, everybody, rich or poor, is going to have to pay this price. So the freebie is a nice short-term illusion. But ultimately, the payment is made by exactly the people who are going to make the freebies. It's just that we don't realize it. We think government is going to do it or some discom is going to do it. It's not going to be that way. So freebies are not really in the interest of the common people, and they're not certainly in the interest of discom and the sector as a whole. So I think it's definitely time for rationalization. But obviously, this is a political issue. I mean, economically speaking, we know that this is completely irrational and unsustainable.
Economics and politics is inextricably linked.
One other point I'd like to raise is that in our obsession for freebie, we often forget that there's also a quality and quantity matter, right? Do we want 24/7 power, or do we want power for 1 or 2 or 4 hours a day cheap? I think again we must understand that there could be a trade-off there, and I think again I would rather pay and get 24/7 power than get free power but get it only for 1 or 2 hours a day.
But Dhiraj, the fact that we're speaking about 24/7 power as an option in the year 2022, when India is one of the fastest growing economies of the world, when we have ambitions to dominate in so many spheres, itself is alarming. It's a given, right? How you have har jal mein nal, you have water everywhere, you're supposed to have power connections everywhere, villages are supposed to be 100% electrified, but someone has to pay for it. Anil Razdan, the step that Mr. Kejriwal has taken, do you think sooner or later states will have to do it? Because there is nothing like a free meal in life. Like, Mr. Nayar said, either the end consumer pays or the taxpayer pays, but someone has to pay. And that is what we need to fix as well as we try and find longer term solutions.
Tamanna, I think, before we take any hard or sensible decision, there normally is a crisis. And I only hope that the present crisis will bring us to 2 or 3 rational decisions. It's rightly said, there's nothing free. And there is nothing more expensive than no power. And what Mr. Kejriwal is saying, and I hope that others will also follow suit to its logical end, is, I would say again in Hindi, der aaye durust aaye. By all means, there are segments of society where whom you have to support. Give them some subsidies. Everybody is not fortunate like you and me. We have to understand that he also has his consumption levels. But I would say, and I suspect that what Mr. Kejriwal is going to do, also, I'm not an astrologer, but I suspect is that you pay first, then you apply to me that I have paid this much for power, and you will get that subsidy to your entitlement from me. That is the way to go about. You pay first, and then subsidy follows later according to your eligibility. That, I think, is one decision that is going to be taken. And I hope the other states follow suit. The other issue is, you see, about imported coal projects running. Well, I read that somewhere that everybody will have to get this coal. Logistically, and speaking from an efficiency point of view, I somehow have my doubts if that is the right way to go about it. I would say that let those stations which are at coastal locations who are going to import the coal, nothing is going to come to us by the land route. It is all going to come to us by the sea route. Let those stations generate the power, and that power will have to be compulsorily picked up by everybody, whoever demands power.
Okay.
Well, that I think would be a much more efficient way of doing it, rather than saying that no, everybody has to take 10% of imported coal. Where is your railway network, and what is the cost of transporting that coal to every power station in the country? I would much rather transmit electricity generated somewhere,
Right.
a certain quota. And I think we also have to recognize that this business of all the fees coming in, the CAG, CBI, etc., all the Cs, they've got to keep their distance.
I'm going to get Mr. Harry Dhaul into this. And first, I'd like your response on the announcement that took place last night, the invocation of Section 11 of the Electricity Act. How will this work practically, Mr. Dhaul? And will now these power companies be able to afford the imported coal?
Well, very simple. The answer is it's going to work very well. But as the earlier speaker said, it's up to a limited capacity. The notification talks about maybe 8 or 9 generating stations belonging to the private sector, which are now mandated under Section 11 to generate power. With regard to the last point made by Mr. Razdan, I think it's a very important point, is about the 3 Cs. Banks are not willing to lend money to the power sector, and they are being dragged into bankruptcy because the discoms are not paying. Now, this is, while it's all right to say that individual owners of these plants are suffering and they should fend for themselves, but I think, and I've been saying this repeatedly, all power generating stations should be declared as national assets. Why? Because it takes a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of permissions, and a lot of effort to set up capacity. Having set up capacity, you can't allow to just go back into scrap because you haven't received money. And banks need to be told to stand by for at least 2 to 3 years to allow the sector to come back. And I think the fear the banks have, as Mr. Razdan pointed out, they fear the 3 Cs, because no banker in his right mind on his own will lend money to a stressed power asset, which is private sector. So in today's context, that won't fly. But Having said that, I can see the government is moving in the right direction by invoking Section 11, which,
But
by the way, has
Mr.
been
Dhaul,
invoked.
instead of bankers now bailing out power companies, wouldn't it make more sense for state governments to pay their dues? And for ultimately someone needs to pay, either the consumer pays, or if the state decides to subsidize certain weaker sections of society, then they need to pay in time. Why
Well, you
should
see-
the banks bail out power companies? Let those who owe the dues pay.
Okay, let me give you some numbers so that we can get the perspective right. We've been told for a long, long time that the agricultural sector is what is getting the subsidy, right? We've done a study where we found out that out of 8,762 hours, because of the monsoon, most parts of India require electricity between 1,800 to 2,000 hours. That's it. That's less than 25% of the total number of hours in a year. My question is, this is all a facade or all a charade that the agricultural sector is the main issue which requires you to do all these things. So if you only require power for the agriculture sector for 2,000 hours out of 8,762 hours, then why this big gap? A. B, you talk about urban areas. Yes, there is a subsidy available to some extent to people who are below the poverty line or require it, etc. And that's what Mr. Kejriwal did in his last government statement. But you see, that's not the main cause for this. If you add up the numbers, agriculture and these guys do not add to creating a situation where there's this huge shortage and there's no money and all that. The problem is much deeper. And therefore, you have to try and fix it. And the way to fix it is very simple. You have a government entity which owes you money. You have a government bank which is chasing you for that money. And it wants to take you to the cleaners under the IBC Act and make you bankrupt or whatever and liquidate you. And therefore, it will liquidate those assets which you created with public money, and it will be available at a song. For example, there have been cases where, for example, if something is available 10,000 crores of debt, it's been sold off at 20%, 2,000 crores or whatever it is, that kind of situation. So the persons who lose in that is the public. The public and the banking sector are losing crores and crores of rupees.
You made this point
this.
several times before, so let me get Dhiraj on it now. And just to add, public is losing in any case. Public is losing when there is power shortage. Public is losing when subsidies are given. Public is losing when subsidies are not given. Yeah. So ultimately, the public is losing. But Dhiraj, do you think that the solution is to get the banks now to back these power companies, or to get state governments to actually pay their arrears? Eventually, someone has to pay.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, it's a question of politics. That's what I said. I mean, the solutions, as have been said, are simple enough, and they've been known for several years. It's not every time a crisis comes up, we discuss it, and then the crisis goes away and things carry on. So, I mean, at some point, as Mr. Razdan said, perhaps in India, a crisis is when we actually get our act together. So let's hope that, good sense prevails. Ultimately, whether it's banks or state discoms, in one way or the other, in our country, they are still, subject to the greater political process. But Tamanna, if you do say that, the public loses every way, I think it's time the public realizes and expresses its view. Because politics in this country responds to what the public, desires or wants. So clearly, if the public didn't want freebies, and really thought they were losing out, then the politicians would not offer them. But that's clearly not the case.
Question of freebies. Let me just cut.
The problem is we all love a freebie.
No, let me come on the question of freebies. I think it's important to come on the question of freebies because Mr. Razdan spoke about it earlier as well. There are sections of society who do deserve and need subsidies. Now, if I'm not mistaken, there was a recommendation that the subsidies on electricity also be given through the DBT route. So you pay your bill and then you get the money that you are supposed to be given, like you do for LPG gas, in your bank account. Why was that thrown out?
So see, again, I mean, it's just, the problem is that comes off the fiscal, of the fisc, right? Then you have to give the subsidies upfront and it reflects in your budget deficit. On the other hand, if you make the discoms give subsidized electricity, then it's off budget. It's as simple as that. So if the governments really want to be transparent, and to some extent, this Modi government has been transparent in bringing off-budget subsidies onto the budget, then bring it all onto the budget. Then you'll know what the realistic picture is and who you want to subsidize and how much you want to subsidize. You get a much more realistic picture. Whereas if you're making the discom subsidize and incur the loss, then it doesn't show on your budget, it doesn't bother the finance minister, it doesn't bother the finance secretary of the state. It must become their headache. It has to be on budget. And that's why it's not happened, because no state government wants the upfront subsidies on their budget. Otherwise, they should be upfront and given DBT. You should pay the discom the market rate and get a refund. That's eminently sensible. But again, who's going to bell the cat and bring it onto the budget?
Yeah,
because the budget deficits are already 9-10%.
So look at the extent
who's going
of
to bring
mess.
it up to 15-16?
Look at the extent of mess. We could blame the weather, we could blame high coal prices, we could blame the geopolitical situation. But the fact is that all these issues and circumstances have just become the tipping point for a big royal mess, because nobody is paying the bill. And somebody needs to now finally pick up the tab if we are to have secured electricity going forward. That's the basic bare minimum that India deserves. I need to end this here, but I want to thank all of you for joining us on the discussion today.